Great to have you all here. And sorry that the rooms have been changing, but the old room, the digital room, has been too small. So we are squeezing in now in the larger room. That's why the link has changed. So today, first of all, to my person, my background is in forestry. I'm a forester at the universities here in Germany and France. And I started to work eventually in Uganda in 2003-04, and that was my start at Global Woods, where I'm also today. But in between of this, I went to different standards, and eventually, especially focusing on forestry standards. And I was a director of the forestry standard at the Gold Standard. That was in 2010. To 2016, and eventually today I'm still quite connected to a lot of different standards, carbon standards in this world. I'm lecturing also at the University of Freiburg, and I have been lecturing in Italy and the US myself. I'm at the moment also consultant to the UNFCCC and the European Union. Because they are also creating their carbon schemes. The UN is having the Paris Agreement, and eventually the European Union, the so-called CRCF. If you want to know more about my CV, please have a look at my LinkedIn. And what I have forgotten on this one is definitely my part where I was also in Solidaridad as a country manager, which is an NGO linked sustainable farmers around the world. So today, what I brought with me is first of all a slide deck, which is used normally for the academia world. So some of the pictures and graphs don't have a trademark or copyright. They're not here for commercial use. And this lecture here is a non-profit lecture for you as an education purpose. And you will get the slides afterwards. This video is also being recorded for the sake of education. So let's kick off. And overall, I will talk to you for about an hour, and then we will stop in order to leave enough room for questions, because with the questions come also a lot of things which become more clear. What I want to give you is especially a foundation of understanding what this is all about. I've seen a lot of people entering this market without the core understanding on what we are eventually talking about when connecting forestry and carbon credits. So overall, forests are part of trees, and trees there's a certain definition behind it, especially important when we talk about bamboo, because bamboo is not a tree. And a tree is normally a multi-annual crop with one dominant sprout, and it's woody. So woody would also be bamboo. One dominant sprout would be bamboo, but a multi-annual crop in terms of growing over time, that is not a bamboo. Bamboo is biologically a grass, and yeah, that's how it is. Still, there are bamboo forests, and what we are talking today mainly about is afforestation, reforestation possibilities under carbon credit schemes. So then we come to the definition of forest. There are, first of all, a lot of national definitions of forest, but the UN has also given a so-called framework on saying you need to be defining your forest on how this is in your country. The link you see here is a link on the UNFCCC webpage, and here you can see eventually, and I'm just going on this live right now, if you type in Uganda here, you will see the definition of Uganda, and here you will see two parts, which are palm trees and bamboo, because they are not trees or a different type of forest. And normally you would need to see here, like for example in Cambodia, this one is accepted by the UN through the definition of Uganda. This is not the case. So in the case of Uganda, the Ugandan government, first of all, would need to report to the UN that they are accepting bamboo forests as becoming part of this forest definition. So that would be one takeaway also for some of the politicians which are maybe in the room. in order to get this classification really on the UN level. But we can still work with this on other levels, which is the voluntary market, and that's a little bit structured differently. I come to this in a second. So let's go back. Forest is the one thing, climate is the other thing, and let's start with the basics. The global temperature is rising, and some parts are rising more than others. Here it's saying Germany, and some slides are still in German. I excuse for that, but I will translate as much as I can. And Europe, for example, is increasing in temperature more quickly than the rest of the global world. And so here we can just see that some parts are affected more than others in this world. Overall, this is what you see. So you have two graphs here, and the question is here, who is emitting mostly the CO2 emissions here into the world? And Africa being in the light blue, being one of the less emitters, but of course the United States, Europe, or parts of Asia being stronger emitters. And you can see on the left side also that especially Asia is rising, A, in population, but also B, in their industries in a very, very significant way. So this left graph is especially showing that if the global world is looking on emissions, they should be looking especially how Asia will go into climate protection, because the other parts of this world, yes, they have a certain responsibility, but Asia is definitely the crucial point if we are looking globally on those emissions. So how are these emissions distributed? Eventually on the left side, you see my focus is always on agriculture, land use, and forestry. You can see here that about 20% of the greenhouse gases are caused by agriculture, land use, and forestry, and about 20 to 30%. That's in my head where this is. So we are 1/3 of the problem, or 1/5 of the problem, but we can also be 1/3 of the solution, because we also have the positive side. And on the right side, you see that where emissions are taking place, they are not all ending up in the atmosphere. They are also ending up in oceans and soils. I come to this in a second. Then there is, and you might have heard before, that there are so-called climate scenarios, and they are called RCPs. RCPs are representative concentration pathways, and often people mix them up with temperature. So be aware that if you hear, for example, RCP 4.5 or 8.5, 8.5 is the worst case scenario. This is not temperaturized. This is eventually representative concentration pathways. It's a scientific name they have given to this, which has to do with radiation, but just don't mix them up. That is my message. So, and when we're talking besides temperature rising, we're talking especially about extreme weather events. Eventually, the temperature rising is something we could, as human beings, adapt to step by step, and but the problem we have with the climate change is the extreme weather events, be it floods, be it storms, be it droughts. That is something which causes for us, and also in an economic way, eventually that costs us money and wealth and also lives. So this is something where you can see that these weather events are at the moment rising and continue to rise and becoming more frequent. Here in Germany, we have just had a heat wave of over 40 degrees. And yeah, that was after 2018. We have already had one, and that will become more frequent, and that's how it is. You will have to cope a lot also with the different rains you have in Uganda. So there are 4 different parts. We won't dig into all of them today just because of time, but let's see how far we get. But I still want to keep enough space also for you to ask questions. There are a lot of acronyms, and I will try to not use them too much, but please, if you hear them, note them, and maybe we can clarify them later on. As we are such a big group, it's better. But the language is just if you go in a certain into a certain scope, you normally have a certain different language. So I hope I'm doing fine with you. Science and measurement. So first of all, when you are in the carbon space, the question is about so-called carbon pools, about greenhouse gases, and then we come to a certain formula I want to explain you a little bit on how we measure carbon in forestry, and then we come to the so-called monitoring, reporting, and verification part of this carbon credit world. Carbon pools is eventually divided into different. There's a division into different aspects, and if you see here, you see especially you look on the orange part. So above ground biomass, below ground biomass, litter, deadwood, and soil. These are the so-called carbon pools, and I have a little cursor here. That's nice. So, and if you look at those, these carbon pools, it's the question, first of all, if they're significant or not. Are they big or are they small? If they are very small, the UN was deciding that if they're under 5%, they are insignificant. We don't calculate them in all the calculations because they are just not relevant. Because in the very, very beginning, everybody was calculating to the 1%, and then it becomes very complicated. So, for example, litter, the leaves that are being shed by trees are not significant. They are left out. Then you have and now we go step by step, sorry. And one thing which is also a carbon pool, but which is sometimes in and sometimes out of the calculation, is what do you use the wood for later on? So there is a so-called system boundary where you say you could include this, but we are not including this because it makes it too complex. And this part is, by the way, called harvested wood products. So if you hear HWP, this is what is a carbon pool of forestry, which is not included in the calculations. So then we go to the significant parts, and you have the above biomass is the most significant part where carbon is being stored. And what you have here is you normally have a tree by the stem. The stem you eventually can measure. And eventually, if you have the stem volume, you go with a certain formula, which is called a biomass expansion factor, from the stem to the entire tree. That is by the biomass expansion factor. And then eventually you can calculate from this also the roots. So there are so-called root-to-shoot factors, and there's a whole long list for all the species. And eventually, like this, you also get the carbon in the roots. So normally you don't dig up all the trees in order to get the full amount of carbon, but you go in there, you just measure the tree in the normal stem. You take the biomass extension factor and you take the root-to-shoot ratio in order to get the entire carbon which is being stored by a tree. If you look at bamboo, I would say that there is probably not really a biomass extension factor, but there will be a root-to-shoot factor on this. So, deadwood is, by the way, deadwood is often not considered in the calculation of carbon projects because it really depends on type of use you are making. But normally, deadwood is kept out of the calculation. There are some forests where deadwood is a significant part, included in the calculation, but not often. And soil carbon is also sometimes included, but you need to understand soil is a very slow-moving slow-moving carbon pool. So if you eventually put a lot of trees which will combust into the soil, it will take a long time to accumulate carbon in the soils. And soil is, in my head, especially when it comes to carbon, it depends if a soil is saturated with water or not. So if, for example, you have peatland and you take away the water out of the peatland, then all the carbon is being released into the atmosphere. So soil is quite sensitive to if there is water saturation, yes or no, and that can release a lot of carbon. But otherwise, if you don't touch it too much in terms of water levels, it's a very slow moving carbon pool. So further than that, one of the understandings I want to give you also is that we always talk about CO2, but there's also methane, there's also nitrogen dioxide, there are other greenhouse gases. And those greenhouse gases have different factors. So just taking the example of here, the factor 28, which is methane. So if 1 ton of CO2 is 1 ton of CO2, 1 ton of methane is 28 tons of CO2. So that is just a relation which is by science given. And there are other gases which have then a certain different factor in influencing the atmosphere. And keep this in mind when it comes to agriculture and cattle. There we have, for example, factors of methane in there. Also, when we come to fertilizer use, then we have different factors because 1 kilogram of fertilizer needs to then be converted to CO2. So that's a little bit the background that there are different greenhouse gases. So and then we have this formula, which I was just mentioning before. So if you go into in forestry, you normally have the ton of CO2, which you want to calculate. You have the cubic meters, which you know normally from the stem, times the biomass extension factor, times the root to shoot value. Then you have already the entire tree biomass. And what you then need to do is you need to look into the so-called wood density. The wood density, you know that some woods are heavier than others, and eventually there are wood density factors for all different species, which you need to multiply. Then you need to multiply times the carbon content, which is in this case 50%. But this is overall 50% if you look into biomass. It changes slightly between 47% and 52%, but normally everybody in the world takes 50. It's a lot easier. So if you see a plant outside, if you move outside to your garden now, you can take a plant and you say 50% of this is carbon. That's you can tell us your wife or your boyfriend, this is how it is. And then you need to take one conversion additional, which is C to CO2, carbon to carbon dioxide. That's just a factor which comes because of chemistry. If you multiply all those together, then you have the tons of CO2 which are part of your forest. This is the formula in a written way. You also have it sometimes more visual in graphics, but it's always the same and it stays the same. I call it the World Forest Carbon Formula. And by the way, there are some more research coming, and eventually, for example, in Nature, there was an article not too long ago which says that in the barks of some of the trees, there are certain microorganisms which are eventually capturing methane. So we are underestimating the climate potential of forest. It has not been included yet in the scientific formulas of carbon project, but I want to show you that science is evolving and maybe we come to even better results, more accurate results in the future. Overall, I can tell you that if you see this formula, you have different parameters, and all these parameters are estimates. So they are not fixed. It's not like in electricity or in something where you have a very precise meter. Nature is always a little bit flexible. And so if you have later on a value for your forest, you can say it's plus minus 20%. That's approximately what it is. You can't get the estimates so accurate as in other technologies or so, this is not possible. This is nature, and we are only trying to make estimates. So, and this is coming back to what I showed you in the graph before. So if CO2 is emitted by fossil fuels into the atmosphere, there is eventually the atmosphere, you need to see like a balloon. There's a certain pressure then coming, and the CO2 is not only ending up in the atmosphere, it's eventually going into the earth and into the water because of the pressure that is coming. And so eventually over time, the CO2 in the atmosphere is step by step also going into into the lithosphere and hydrosphere, they're called. And this is what this graph shows. And that's why also our oceans are becoming more acid, because eventually if the CO2 goes into the water, it has a chemical reaction and the oceans are becoming more acid. This is the reason for that. So, and then coming lastly to the monitoring, verification, reporting and verification. This is how you measure this. And eventually, if you measure this, up to today, you use different methods. And normally you come with so-called pictures. So pictures out of satellites. They are being made. This is on the left side, you see this. And here you have on the one side satellite pictures. You also have a new technology, which is a radar. And with the radar, you cannot see the colors, but you can see the height of the trees. So it's becoming more and more accurate that from space you can eventually monitor how the forests are developing and evolving. Still, normally, and this is the person on the right side, you need to have people on the ground which are once in a while measuring the trees in order to confirm if the data which is measured from space is correct. And then on the low side, you see this graph. This is eventually showing how you measure, and you always have different trees which are then a little bit smaller and a little bit bigger, and there's a certain average in this. That's where we are in terms of technology. Maybe in future, at some point of time, we don't need to go to the woods and measure them again. But up to now, in the last 20 years, this is eventually what my work was also often all about. And we're still doing it the old-fashioned way, the way you can see here. So let's move on into the political and finance sphere. Here I want to take you on a journey from Kyoto to Paris. So there's the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement. That has been the big shift in the last 20, 30 years on the political side. And to understand this better, first of all, you need to understand where this all comes from. Kyoto was in 1997, and it divided the world into eventually industrial and developing countries. This was what Kyoto was saying. We have two different worlds, the ones who emit and the other ones who don't emit, who need to be supported in their activities. And a lot of countries were very unhappy with this division. And eventually it was also questioned after a time, why do we need this division? Because we are, for example, some Asian countries, we are evolving and we don't want to be seen as developing countries anymore. We want to be seen as industrial countries. So eventually it ended up in a big discussion where they were all saying, well, if climate change is going to continue like this, it doesn't really matter if you're rich or poor, you're all ending up in one grave. And like this, the people were saying, okay, we need to change the system. The entire system was changed from this Kyoto Protocol to the so-called Paris Agreement. And Paris Agreement is much more on an eye-to-eye level. So here, the governments and states, there are no differentiation anymore of industrial or developing countries, as they were called. They're all the same. And the question is here, how do we contribute to climate protection? And the contribution everybody can do on its own, they were saying. So it's a lot more liberal, a lot more freedom in saying, okay, you take your choice on your government level and saying, how do you contribute to climate protection? The only thing we do is we make it all transparent, so people can see if what the plans are that you are putting up in public, and the pledges are made publicly available, and eventually then we rate them. We see if this makes all sense, or if you are not really contributing fairly to the world here. And this is what you have. You have a couple of websites. This one is the Climate Action Tracker, which is then taking certain governments and saying, okay, I analyze their policies and saying, okay, is it good enough or is it not good enough? One main rule, so that is one of the main rules also of the Paris Agreement, is transparency. Another main rule of the Paris Agreement is that you have a screw. You are only allowed to tighten the screw. You are never allowed to go back. So whatever you put on policy to say, yes, we're doing this, the next year you cannot go back. You can only go further. The only the only way to go back is to drop fully out. If you see Mr. Trump, that's exactly what he's doing. But yeah, you can definitely not put your screw back. You need to tighten it only, or exit. Then you are not part of the game anymore. Overall, when then the people are collecting all of this information and saying, okay, is this sufficiently, all the voluntary commitments the governments are providing, is this sufficient in order to meet a certain threshold? So the world has put itself a threshold as maximum 2 or 1.5 degrees. Here they haven't really fully agreed, but eventually that's why you see often graphs on 2 degrees and on 1.5. And then there is one report coming out on a yearly base, which is the called emission gap report. And the emission gap report is eventually showing, are we still missing, are we not on track eventually for 2 degrees or 1.5? And we are not, and eventually they are showing what is still the gap. So here you can see on a yearly base that we still, as the world, still need to act much faster and much stronger in order to eventually be possibly reaching the goal of 1.5 to 2 degrees. By the way, 1.5 degrees, globally, we're reaching probably in these years. So this next year, somewhere around. In Europe, we have already reached 1.5 degrees. And yeah, the heat waves and other things are becoming definitely stronger. You can feel that. So just taking you also on this journey, I'm now making a comparison with a car. This is an old Corolla car, the most sold car in the world. And in 1997, this was the Kyoto Protocol starting. And you need to imagine that only after this, the people were asking, but how much carbon do we have actually in forestry? And only in 2005, eventually, they were developing methodologies on how to calculate carbon in forestry. That is not too long ago, eventually. And here the World Bank was eventually providing money for scientists to developing those methodologies. Then in 2006, there was a certain knowledge base being developed, which is today still one of the big knowledge bases people are referring to. And it's by the IPCC, which is eventually the scientific arm of the UN, FCCC. And so there's the UN, and the UN has different branches, and UNFCCC is the climate branch. And then eventually the first carbon credits were coming on the market by the UN. And one of the stronger markets for buying those credits was the EU, but they were deciding that they will not allow removal credits or eventually forest credits to becoming part of their emission trading scheme. That was a decision. If you see this, that only a couple of years before they have worked into how to best calculate it. It was an okay decision by the EU to be saying, okay, let's first of all wait until we see how this market develops in order to have it then integrated into our market. And you can see later on that they were correct in a certain way, wait a little bit, because not all formulas who have been put up were fully correct. So then eventually the UN, because the UN was not covering all kinds of projects, carbon projects, there were a lot of different standards evolving. And so amongst others, the gold standard was mainly there to cover the social and ecological benefits or the impacts of those projects, because the UN did not agree on any social and ecological rules, and eventually the gold standard was there to cover this. And then the VCS was there to cover a lot of different methodologies, which the UN didn't cover. And Carbon Fix by that time was one of the early forest protocols, but there were a couple other carbon standards also. Overall, until 2012, there were a lot of projects being developed then in the world, about 10,000, and only 1% of them were eventually removal or forest credits. And this was because there was just a lot of uncertainty and people were not knowing if they should really buy this or not. And so there was very, very little community eventually on this one. And only a few pioneers were starting their work in those days. Then eventually in 2012 to 16, this whole revolution of the Kyoto to Paris Agreement came, because the countries were frustrated, and eventually the new setup of this Paris Agreement was in 2016. 2016 is 10 years ago now, and it just takes a long time because we will talk about later about how the Paris Agreement will be implemented now, but it just takes a long time if the UN takes certain steps. In any case, in 2018, 19, 20, in the supermarkets in Europe at least, but also in the US, in many countries, you were able to see a lot of claims, so-called carbon claims, carbon neutral products. You were seeing pretty much everywhere on all the different products. And this was because more and more companies were saying, okay, we need to do something. We're buying carbon credits in order to compensate for our emissions of the different products. And also, you might have seen this lady, the Fridays for Future, and Greta Thunberg was eventually, lobbying for climate protection worldwide. And it just became a big movement. If you see in 2018, 19, the carbon markets were rising because there was just a lot of more awareness on this topic. And on top of that, in Europe, there was an extreme drought. And eventually, there was a super high awareness during this time. During this time, as said, also a lot of people were then buying carbon credits. And because carbon credits is then something very intangible, they liked to buy carbon credits which have a certain face. And the face here was the nature-based solution credits which are linked to reforestation, protection of forest, agriculture. That's where you see green. And you don't see too much green if you have a water power station or a solar system. So the people were liking eventually to buy carbon credits from nature. And especially this market went way up. With markets going up, there was a lot of money being attracted, a lot of venture capital coming in. And and a little bit also the sharks came in to see if they can make money in this sector. And then there was a crash of the Corolla car, which has come because there was actually an article of the Guardian and the Zeit, which is a German newspaper, which showed that some of the carbon credits, especially from the protection of forest, were fake. And it was not a little amount. It was 90% of certain projects were just, we call them hot air. They were just not real. And this was so big of a thing that because there were a lot of big companies also involved, they have just been buying this without knowing and without understanding much. And eventually they got a very bad reputation on after this. And it ended up in law cases. So a lot of different law cases, especially in the US and in Europe, were saying, yeah, you cannot do this in that way. You can still do it, but you cannot do it in this way. And up to now, a lot of companies are saying we are still not certain exactly how we should do it, and that's why we don't do anything. So that since 2023, the market has crashed and has eventually gone down, and this is where we are. And as a counter reaction of this, the market is today talking a lot about so-called high integrity carbon credits, and there are certain initiatives which were trying to solve the problem in different ways. And eventually some of them were saying that the carbon standards were not good enough. Some were saying we need to be looking, have an extra judgment on the project. And some of them were saying, well, we first need to work on that, that the companies are doing their homework in terms of reduction of CO2 emissions first before they offset. All of this is correct, and there have been a lot of movements in the last couple of years in the market. And I can definitely see that a lot of people are very confused on why this is all happening, in what direction it is going. But eventually it is the effect of 2023 of the Guardian article, which is there, and then the hype of which was a couple of years ago, that we need to do something. At this very moment, the EU and others are trying to give more certainty into the market. So they are trying to say, okay, how do you best buy carbon credits, and what can you claim, and how do you best do this? But it's not yet, this process has not yet finalized, and eventually that's why companies are still in limbo at the moment. And I rather don't do anything before I do something wrong, although they want to do something good. But at the moment, it's really a lot of companies are on standby. So, and besides this, also the UN is back on stage in terms of building a carbon standard. Also the EU is doing. So both the EU and the UN are at the moment back on stage in terms of building carbon standards, which will influence the entire carbon markets again. But as I mentioned before, this will take time. These are big standards which are evolving. So that's where we are today, eventually, on this picture. And I can tell you, the car has been crashed. It will crash again, a little bit to the right and left. And that's how it is if you are constructing new things. But at some point of time, I'm very certain we will have a finished car, which is hopefully driving very stable, or high speed in terms of really developing carbon projects. So let's come to the different markets, and I want to show you that there are two types of markets mainly. The one is the so-called compliance market or mandatory market. The market is eventually overall divided into this mandatory markets and the voluntary markets. The voluntary is moreover backed up by society and NGOs. They say you voluntarily should do something. And the other market is eventually politics is deciding that companies need to do something. And if you look at the mandatory markets, there are maps like this one from the World Bank. And you can see here that there are markets all over our world. So eventually you hear a lot about the European emission trading system, but you can also see that there are much smaller markets in regional, in different constellations. And I myself, I can't keep track on all the legislations which are there. And I even heard that Kenya, I think, wants to move into a carbon market. And you need to see at the moment, eventually, a lot more people have understood how this whole process of carbon credits is working. And eventually they are bringing this back to their governments in order to apply it. And maybe even in Uganda, you will see at some point of time a certain carbon market being put in place. Before a carbon market normally comes a carbon tax. Carbon tax is that certain industries are being that there is a certain tax being put on the emissions they make, and eventually the government first of all collects the money in order to spend it then on in subsidies in certain directions. That's often the way it starts with the carbon tax, and then the second move is into a real emission trading system where companies who then eventually emit, so they get certain caps in terms of you are allowed to do so many emissions, and if you are under this cap you can start trading those emissions on the market. But it's a step-by-step process, but as said, more and more governments are understanding this, and more are then moving into the space. Overall, and an ETS is an emission trading system, can choose, it's like a toolbox. Eventually you can choose between which greenhouse gases do you want to become part of your emission trading system and which sector. So is it the power sector, the transport sector, is it agriculture or forestry? And the government can say this is in or this is out, and that's up to a political choice eventually to do this. So you have those about 10 greenhouse gases, you have different sectors, and then you have different methodologies. In forestry, for example, you have avoided deforestation that you can get carbon credits from, but you can also get it from afforestation. And so there are different elements eventually from under different sectors. And then you have over 10,000 national regional records, because you have different tree species then in Uganda, then in South Africa, then in whatever. And so you have a lot of different data sets which are eventually ending up in such, or how to calculate carbon credits in a certain scheme, into a certain emission trading scheme. And again, here you can see that all the governments who have decided to move into this have then selected certain scopes, certain sectors, certain gases, etc. And yeah, there are databases where you can get this information, but I can't tell you on what this is. So overall, you can also in your head divide into so-called tech removals, nature-based removals, and avoidance credits. Avoidance, you have seen, is often linked with technologies like wind energy or solar energy, etc. These credits are mainly traded at about $2 to $10 in those markets. If you look at nature-based solution removals, they are, for example, afforestation, reforestation, you come into a price range of $20 to $100 approximately. 100 would be quite a bit already. And then you have the newer carbon credits, which are the tech removals. They've only been there for maybe the last 5 years, and they are having prices which are very, very high, on 150 to 800. And yeah, just to give you also to see how different those prices can be. And if you're looking into carbon markets, you need to look very precisely on if you have carbon credits from forestry, for example, you need to look very precisely on what prices are being achieved, because you cannot compare them with really other carbon credits which are on the market. So, and then we come to the voluntary markets. The voluntary markets, first of all, the big saying in the voluntary carbon market, also called VCM, is you first should avoid, then you should reduce, and then you should compensate. So avoid is really trying not to take the car. Eventually reduce is to put a solar cell on the roof, and the compensate would be the planting of trees. But this avoidance, reduction, and compensation is eventually the big thing in the voluntary carbon market, and you see all kinds of graphics which are showing exactly the same. The question is then for companies, but when is the right time to compensate? Because how much do I need to reduce in order to compensate? And this is an answer which is not so easy to give. And there have and if and because it's not so easy to give, the companies are often blamed of greenwashing because they start to compensate too early. So they just don't do too much in terms of reduction, and they start right away to compensate. And then eventually they come into the blame of so-called greenwashing. This is, that's a term which is being used. And this is also where, for example, The Guardian has been saying it's not only that these credits from these projects were wrongly calculated, but on top of that, the companies who have bought them have done greenwashing because they didn't really reduce too much. They were just buying carbon credits. There is an initiative which is key in this world on telling companies how much they need to reduce before they compensate. And this is the so-called Science-Based Target Initiative by WWF and a couple others. And this is giving clear guidelines to different sectors. And so it's very small, but eventually there are different sectors, which is oil and gas, aviation, and chemistry, etc. So if you're part of such a big company, you could go there and see, okay, that's a protocol eventually, which is made for me on how to best do my reduction and later on compensate. What the Science-Based Target Initiative is not good yet for is the small and medium enterprises, the SMEs. They are eventually looking especially on the big companies on this to give guidance. So, and all these carbon labels, which have been there on carbon neutral products and on these supermarkets, have now eventually, because of all these law cases, etc., either they are gone because they are saying we're just not doing it anymore. Why should we do something if we later on end up in court? Or they have eventually used different terminologies. And here again, you can see just as a summary, the market reaction was for greenwashing. Eventually, the Science-Based Target Initiative was being created. And for the standards to calculate better, there are 3 initiatives called ICVCM. The upper one is ICVCM. That's the most known one. But there's also ECROA or CCQI. That's already very, very detailed. But in any case, as mentioned before, here are different new claims: net zero, smart carbon, climate positive, climate wise. And you can see on the lower side a graph where the market is. It went up and eventually it went after this crash quite back down. And this is where we are still at this moment on the market side. So, and here especially in Europe, they are trying to give guidance. So the European Parliament is trying to give guidance on how to do the whole thing eventually. It has not yet progressed so far that I can show you exactly how it should be done, but it's coming step by step to a stage where I would say that probably by next year, bigger companies feel comfortable again enough to buy carbon credits from certain standards, etc., etc. But yeah, that's a little bit the history of that. Okay, and now I'm looking on the watch. I still have about 10 minutes. We will dive into some parts of forest carbon standards now, and then we will stop for discussion. If you look at forest carbon standards, eventually you can see different labels, and some of them you know, some of them you might have heard of, and you can divide them into carbon standards. There's sustainable forest management, there's sustainable agriculture management, or something like fair trade. But you can also do them and divide them differently into social ecological standards and carbon standards. This is a little bit where I'm normally dividing them in those 2 different spheres. And in a carbon standard, you always have a part which is on the methodologies, which is how to quantify, how to calculate. Additionality, we come to this in a second. Then permanence is about that there is a certain risk of trees, for example, that they can burn down, and certain sustainability rules, which is that any carbon project which is being implemented should always watch that communities are fairly treated, are treated fair in a fair way, and ecological impact is minimized or even positive. There are some standards which have their own rules, but you can also put a partnership. So the gold standard, for example, when I was working at the gold standard, we were initiating a partnership in forestry with FSC. So if you have the gold standard, you can eventually take the rule. If you are FSC certified, you don't need to comply to the sustainability rules of the gold standard. So that is something every standard eventually can do by its own. And the quantification, here I wrote that there are a lot of startups which have tools online where you can try to do the quantification in an easier way than just in a regular Excel table. Overall, in my opinion, these partnerships make just a lot of sense because sustainability rules, for example, are fairly the same amongst different project types. And yeah, partnerships just make a lot of sense in my opinion. So we don't repeat the work which has been done before. Overall, there are by now quite a lot of different carbon standards. I would guess that there are about 50 carbon standards worldwide, and about 25 of them are related. And now we come to, for example, Ugandan legislation, which has accepted, I think, 2 or 3 by now. But yeah, they will need to be looking, in my opinion, again into the different standards, because especially in the last 5 years, there have been a tremendous amount of different standards coming up, and then all kinds of legislation or companies need to be screening them and need to be saying, okay, are they good enough for me? Are they not good enough for me? But overall, it's, yeah, also us as experts, we're losing the overview. And if somebody says, I want this and this standard, we need to look into depth ourselves in order to give advice if this one is a good choice or not. So how do carbon standards normally work? You have then, in general, you have the forest owner and the project developer. In total, this is, they belong together, and they are then later on the seller of the carbon credits, and they sell the certificates to the buyers, and in between is the carbon standard, and the carbon standard is being used as a rule book for somebody to check, and the check is being made by the auditor. The auditor can be selected by eventually the seller. So you can hire a lot of different companies in order to do this check. Then normally the auditor then comes on site, has a look if the project is in line with the carbon standard, and if he thinks that's fine, then he gives you a green light. And eventually, based on this green light or the certification report, you get carbon credits, and they end up in a registry, a so-called carbon registry. And the carbon registry is nothing else like a bank account, but instead of having Uganda shillings, you have carbon credits on your bank account. And you can then transfer them to a different buyer if he has also if he also has a bank account there. If he doesn't have a bank account there, you can retire on behalf of the buyer. That is also a possibility. That depends a little bit on whom you have as a buyer. But this picture shows you a little bit on how it doesn't matter which carbon standard you have, on how the certification is being structured. So overall, as said, we have a lot of different carbon standards, and you need to understand that some of the carbon standards are very specialized carbon standards. So some of them are they have it all. They can sell everything. And Vera, gold standard, the UN standard, they normally have it all. And then there are very specialized ones, which are in a niche market, which is on forestry, but which is on waste, which is on shipping, on whatever. And sometimes also geographically. So Cert Carbono, for example, is a standard just at the moment evolving in Latin America quite a bit. I've not seen one especially focusing on Africa, but maybe there are some people in the room who like to move into this space also. So, and overall, a standard is being structured always in a very similar way. You have on top, you have principles. The principles are about 5 to 10. They give a high-level goals. Then you have criteria, which are about 20 to 50, and the methodologies, and then indicators of the criteria. And this is how a normal structure of a standard is. And eventually, every standard is also using its own glossary, its own terms, and its own process. And so eventually, if you're digging into this, you will see a very similar structure in all the carbon standards which are out there. Now, coming to the different forest project types, overall, there are 3 forest project types. This is afforestation, reforestation, improved forest management, and RED. And improved forest management is, yeah, as the word is already saying, and RED is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. Overall, I was mentioning before that we have different prices amongst them, and also different sizes. So if you have an afforestation reforestation project, normally the project is between 10 and 10,000 hectares. I would say in average, we have here about 2,000 hectares in average globally a reforestation project is. And 10 would be extremely small. I've almost barely seen this. Normally, I would recommend that you have at least somewhere around 200, 300, 400, 500 hectares in order to have a project. But what you can also do is you start with a project and you add areas over time to get to this size. Improved forest management, you especially see in the US and in Europe. Here the projects are much bigger, normally somewhere around 10,000 hectares. So in average, the prices of the credits are 20 to about 100 euros. And then you have RED credits. They are mainly then in the tropical countries. And here we talk about avoidance credits, because here you are avoiding that emissions are being released through the destruction of forest, and they are much cheaper in this. That's why also companies like them in buying them. But yeah, they are not but overall they are normally a big size project above 50,000 hectares. And if you think about above 50,000 hectares, there are normally also a lot of governments involved, because it's just a huge area and normally that is being covered. So I'm looking on the watch because I want to really keep the space open now for tons of questions. I've seen a couple. I would still have a couple of slides, but I keep it really there to be answering then also your questions, because that is part of today's journey. And yeah, first of all, thank you very much. And now I hand over for Lucas or Robert, who is moderating.
Yes, thank you so much, Moriz, for this session. And like I've put in the chat, if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'm going to try see how I can see all these hands, because they are flying up. I saw David Bauer was the first, I think. So if I remember well, so you can start and ask.
No, I just applauded. It was a very nice session into this.
Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to express my gratitude for giving us this introduction here.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, so I am just discovering the difference between applauding and raising a hand.
Hello, Lucas.
Yes, Robert.
There's a few questions in the Q&A. And anyone can go. Okay. You can go to the Q&A. Anyone, please tap the 3 dots and then look at tools. And inside tools, you'll find poll or Q&A,
Yes,
question
we have
and
6
answer.
questions.
And you can drop your
did
questions
already.
there. Yeah.
So let's start from there. Let me see a question that is directly going to Moriz. What is the criteria for implementing a bamboo carbon credit project in Uganda by Emmanuel Hedwig?
Yeah. So if you want to eventually start a carbon project in Uganda, the first question would be about what is your size? Because if you are too small and the whole certification, the whole procedure to get certified and to get carbon credits is quite expensive, and that's why you have certain thresholds of, in my opinion, somewhere around 500 hectares, where you would say. So if you have 500 hectares, then I would say, okay, go ahead and try to register. Where you need to look into when registering are different parts. I come to this. If you are not having the 500 hectares, and maybe this would also be a role for Bamboo Uganda to cluster, to really say, okay, who is interested in becoming part of the Bamboo Uganda carbon project here in Uganda in order to get certification, in order to get carbon credits. So that's the size. Then the next question is, you need to, and this is also very important, you need to later on prove that your carbon money, which is coming in, is necessary to have. And it's called additionality. And of course, that sounds interesting because it's a little bit a flexible tool, what we have here. You need to prove, because if you're already doing it at the moment, and then the carbon buyer who buys the certificate would say, why do I give you carbon money? Because you're already doing it. So there's no need. But of course, with additional carbon money, you can go faster, and you also can de-risk certain investments. And this is something where normally this is all about the additionality argumentation you need to have, is that investing in Uganda there's a certain risk associated to this, and also in bamboo, it's a new plant, etc. And in additionality, you would eventually argue that I wouldn't invest in the bamboo plantation if I wouldn't get the carbon credits. That would be the argumentation behind it. And if you have argued this, and this is for all the people who would be joining such a project, that is the essential additionality rule. And if you pass this test, so-called additionality test, then you are eligible. That is also a crucial point here. By the way, this is also not only, let's say, a financial test, do you really need the money, but it's also a test on regulatory, on is there a law which is saying that you must plant bamboo on your ground? If you can answer it no, then perfect, because then you are additional eventually. So there are a couple tests in additionality which you need to pass, and eventually when you have justified this, you will have this in a big document which is called the PDD, a project design document. And this PDD is the foundation to give to a certification body in order to get the certification. For the certification, you need to choose a carbon standard. And in the carbon standard, it goes back into, at the moment, there are only certain carbon standards being accepted by the new law in Uganda. So you need to watch out on which carbon standard you're using in order to later on being able to act according to the laws in Uganda. If you have this, then eventually you get your carbon certificates by the amount of growth you have in bamboo. In bamboo, you are reaching a certain size, and eventually, the trees are at some point of time mature. What is, in my opinion, crucial in Uganda, in bamboo, is that you later on also use the harvested wood product carbon pool, because eventually mainly you're producing bamboo in order to make something out of that, furniture, etc. And this is something where you also need to have look very precisely if the standards allowing for this, and what do you need to give as proof where this carbon ends up. You always need to think in a carbon perspective. The carbon is in the bamboo, and where will it end up? And will it be in a house? And how long will the house be in order not to go back to the atmosphere too fast? So that would be my step-by-step process when looking into something like this.
All right, thank you, and thanks everyone for keep the questions coming. It's the easiest is under Q&A. A few questions. One of my colleagues might have to help Moriz. They are more about Bamboo Uganda sometimes. Someone is asking, has anyone in Uganda actually been paid for carbon credits? And if yes, which ones and by who? So in case Moriz is not aware, because of course I know Moriz is among those who is going to apply for the carbon credits himself, but if anyone else knows, can also contribute on that one.
Well, Global Woods has been one of the pioneers also with the reforestation in Chikonda. And eventually they have been planting trees in 2001, registering this as a carbon project, and since then gaining carbon credits and eventually selling them. They are registered under the gold standard, and yeah, and that's a live project which you can see online, but you can also visit. Is from Kampala to Hoima, traveling about 3 hours. On the left side, there's a big plantation. That's a carbon project which is being registered. But you can look also in the different registries of the VCS, which is also called Vera or Gold Standard, and you can look for Forest and Uganda, and there you will see there are some other projects, not only the one of Global Woods.
Okay, that's good. So already a project that is over 20 years old is has been benefiting from carbon credits, basically. Yeah, someone in line with what I think this might have already been answered. Can we register for a carbon standard jointly or as a group, for example, under Bamboo Uganda for bamboo growers? Like you mentioned something like a cluster. Any advice how to do that practically? Or?
Yeah, so practically, I would say that whoever is interested, and I would advise Bamboo Uganda to write one time an email, ask for how many hectares or acres would you be interested, and then really try to facilitate for the people to come together, because as I said, bamboo is normally spread in smaller pieces, and yeah, to cluster them, then to apply in a clustered way, that works much better and much easier for the individual farmers. But let's talk. Bamboo Uganda and we can talk a little bit later on how to exactly do this. The message for the listeners is there should be a survey coming, hopefully from Bamboo Uganda, and asking for if you are interested, and then later on we can see how many people are interested, if it's worth it.
All right, thank you. Someone is saying, what is the most profitable way to earn carbon credits for bamboo players? Is it planting, growing bamboo? Is it product manufacturing? For example, furniture? Is it biochar or building materials?
So the easy answer is whoever grows it has the first right on saying how to use it. So even whoever is making furniture out of it or biochar, they need to get the right of carbon credits from the landowner. So if you are the landowner and growing this, you can make your choice if you want to forward your carbon rights to somebody else or not. And eventually that would be also, yeah, depending, of course, in what industry you are in. If you are having more manufacturing background, then you can also move into this, but you need to be asking whenever you get your raw material in, that you also get the carbon rights of those raw materials. It doesn't matter if it's bamboo or if it's any other material, you will need to be securing eventually your carbon rights from this. And by the way, this is also because Prime Biochar is in the biochar business. So from whomever Prime Biochar is getting its biomass, they are asking, okay, we pay you a certain price for the biomass, but we also get the carbon rights for this.
Okay. Yeah, because someone also asked if you could talk about biochar briefly, but I think you have made already the link. Yeah, this is a good one. Are all credits currently being issued at the forestry level, or are there methodologies existing / being developed for the storage of carbon in bamboo-based buildings?
Yeah. So the harvested wood products, there are some methodologies, but they are very rare. And I would, at the moment, on the gold standard, I would doubt that there is a methodology on harvested wood products on the VCS. I would need to look this up, but harvested wood products later on is much more difficult. Much more difficult to calculate because you need to have traceability. If you are selling your bamboo sticks into a market, it comes from outside to Kampala, for example, and in Kampala it's a wholesaler, a small seller, and then it ends up. And the one who ends up, the question wherever it ends up, he also needs to commit to how long will the carbon being stored in whatever building. And at the moment, this is the main challenge when it comes to harvested wood products, is that the whole supply chain needs to be eventually working together in order to get this carbon eventually registered as a carbon credit. But that is also something I would say Bamboo Uganda can really better do than a single player. And that at this moment, I can't tell you exactly, but I would love to look with Bamboo Uganda into this, because I also see potential of this for Uganda in the bamboo sector. Yes.
All right. Someone has asked, didn't Bill Gates pull out of funding carbon credits, removing 80% of carbon credits funding globally?
Yeah. So yes, there was a big message about 3-4 months ago. So you need to understand that in recent years, so about 3-4 years, eventually also Bill Gates and Microsoft were going strongly into this market in buying carbon credits and eventually offsetting some of the even historic emissions of his company. Now, Bill Gates and Microsoft were focusing very strongly on the market of removals only. That's a certain perception they have had, and they were saying we only move into this, and we transparently communicate how we do this and how many amounts, much more in a transparent way than a lot of other companies. That's why they became quite famous in doing so, because they've been doing it in a very transparent way. And now 3-4 months ago, eventually Microsoft has been seen as a pioneer and one of the front runners in doing their activities. And now not only Microsoft, but a lot of others have been saying, I'm not moving in further into this space before I have not certainty. This was also in my talk. And Microsoft has almost been the last one standing. And that's why eventually the message was then, okay, if Microsoft now pulls out 80% of the market, and then the market is fully dead. But before there have been others who have been step by step moving out. I would, first of all, they have not said that they're moving out totally. They are saying they are pausing. And 90%, 95% of the big companies are currently pausing and saying, guys, we need more certainty in order, if we do something on a voluntary base, we are not getting blamed for anything later on. And I have to admit, I can really understand those players, those CEOs who need to take a decision, because they're spending money on something and later on getting in front of court and justifying why they have spent money is not the right way normally. Yeah.
All right. There's a couple of new questions. One sec. Oh, people are generally appreciating. Are projects that have already established bamboo plantations on community land eligible?
Yeah, difficult, because later on you have the additionality question. If you have already planted, and then, the question is, of course, your motivation during this planting time was maybe without the carbon credits, and then the question is, why should you get carbon credits on top of that? Of course, for me, this is always a step-by-step process. You are trying, especially in nature, you're trying things in a small scale, piloting, feasibility, and then you are starting to expand over time. So there is a certain flexibility of justifying that you have started, but of course you can only scale when you have a certain proof of concept. So the standards are normally also allowing in a little flexibility on this. This is called retroactive accounting. So if you register a project now, sometimes you can go up to 2 years back and take this into your project. But it is something to be looked at in a very individual case and saying, okay, show me what you have done, why you have done it, etc. And in Uganda, I have to admit, the circumstances in Uganda are quite favorable for this additionality rule, because you are a country where there is not a lot of international investments in a streamlined way. And that's why you can nicely and more easily justify that, yes, we need this money in order to do a lot of things, trials, pilots, feasibility, knowledge, to build knowledge up for how to grow things like this, where in other countries you might have established bamboo industry, and then it's not so easy to justify this. And here, this is exactly what is additional or not additional later on.
All right, thank you. Someone is asking, are projects, let me see, there's one. Are the countries of Central Africa involved in these bamboo carbon credits projects?
Yeah, so overall, I looked up also using AI, and then AI is, by the way, a great tool also for all of you to be the questions you have. If you are not satisfied with my answer, go again and put all the background information on your projects, on your ideas in there, and ask Gemini, ChatGPT on those topics, because it really also can give you a good answer and a good feeling. But don't trust it fully, because it's it doesn't know everything. There are about 10 projects on bamboo carbon worldwide being registered. So there are not many eventually. And and some of them might be in Central Africa. I would need to look up the list again. But if you use AI, you can be directed to the normally carbon registry. So you can just ask, please have a look at all carbon registries in the world and check for bamboo forest projects and select the ones, or give me the links which are in Central Africa, for example, and then have a look there. And there aren't many. There are somewhere close to 10.
Okay. This question, maybe we have to revert the person to the PowerPoint, the presentation, but how is bamboo carbon credit measured and what is the methodology?
Yeah. So I would almost give this question or forward this question on, because Bamboo Uganda knows probably much better than I do on how bamboo is being measured in terms of, and when it comes to the factory, it's normally measured by weight as far as I know. So eventually, if there are formulas which are then converting what you measure like a tree being converted to the overall weight. This is something I'm not too familiar with the so-called inventory. So it's called the forest inventory, but the bamboo inventory, if you do this by measuring the different bamboo things, or if you, yeah, I give this back to the experts here on the bamboo.
Okay.
By the way, just to add there, Moriz and Lucas, you mentioned AI, and the World Bamboo Organization, which to which Bamboo Uganda is a partner, has developed a bamboo AI. All right, and it's called Dr. Take, which is Japanese for bamboo. I am going to post the link. It's on www.worldbambooscience.net. I'll just post the link. Yeah, so Bamboo AI has been developed. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, this is good. We saw the need for this because bamboo grows different in different countries. So we saw the need for a more central point of information. Let's see. Yeah, someone says, can we as Africa Bamboo, not sure if that is an organization or the person means different bamboo growers in Africa, but can we develop a bamboo carbon credit project together? So maybe the question is if it goes cross borders or it stays within the borders.
So my advice is not to go cross borders with carbon projects, because carbon projects are quite linked to national legislation, and more being linked on this one. That's why I would definitely cluster within the country. Clustering makes a lot of sense because it's just on the size, but also for individuals to drop in, drop out, and that would be much easier. But yeah, that's exactly the idea which is put forward here, and I think that, in my opinion, that makes a lot of sense to make a one bigger project by Bamboo Uganda as a project developer to be developed, and then different people eventually can join this. And this is, by the way, called a POA, a program of activity. So that is not new. It's used by, and you have heard maybe of cook stoves or whatever. These are all so-called POA projects where you have a lot of individuals coming together as one.
Okay. Someone is asking us, can you run the next masterclass specifically on how to register for carbon credits in Uganda step by step?
Yeah, so if there's a large enough group who are interested, that would be, in my opinion, the step would be to say, okay, Bamboo Uganda is also as an entity, we would need to legally check if they're willing to take this role and liability, etc. And then getting together and seeing, okay, how do we best structure this, onboard the different players, etc. But first of all, of course, we need to find out how many are there who are interested in this, and how many hectares would this be, etc.
Okay.
Just to add some information on that, thank you, Lucas and Moriz, of course. So for our people who are just hearing about Bamboo Uganda Bamboo Uganda has actually mapped all the private bamboo plantations in Uganda, and we have this information. And if you're out there and you have not been mapped, please go to the chat. Lucas has posted a link on how you can become a member of Bamboo Uganda. Then we shall come and profile your plantation and map it. Even if you are just planning to plant, to establish a bamboo plantation or a bamboo factory or a consultancy like an architect or a contractor or a builder, please go to the chat room and pick up on that link that Lucas has posted, become a member, and have the visibility of everything that is happening in the bamboo sector in Uganda. Please continue. Thank you.
All right, thank you. There's someone has asked in the chat, I see, what is, first of all, thank you for the informed scientific view, but what would be, according to you, the best species for the Ugandan climates?
In terms of bamboo,
Yes.
that would be a question for the experts of Bamboo Uganda.
Yes,
I mean, later on, it's you need to see that the value out of carbon comes with the density and the growth, and you need to see if whatever species you grow, if the value is here more in the construction, or maybe there's a sweet spot between the construction and the carbon. And overall, I normally tend to say that the do not focus too much on the carbon itself as bringing the value. Focus on what is your product gonna be, because that is later on the main source of income. Carbon credits are an add-on, as I would normally say, and the add-on is step by step rising in terms of prices. That's why it becomes more and more competitive to the normal products. But I at the moment wouldn't advise to put carbon first and say, okay, we're planting this just for the carbon reason. That's not the advice I would give.
Okay, so plant it. The business model, in other words, should not be focused 100% on carbon. Yeah,
and that is also the background is not only that. Later on, the question is for me, there are certain risks associated with this, and the risks are that carbon market prices are not picking up. You might not be fully eligible under carbon standard, etc., etc. And then later on, I don't want farmers in a situation where they are fully dependent on this carbon money, because the carbon money is just not a money like it is when you are growing coffee or cocoa or whatever. It is not later on a commodity which has a market that is nicely and easily selling in a global market. That's not how it is. You need to be precise, the standard, the legislation, etc. And at the moment, my advice is not, maybe in 10 years, I would say, yeah, you can do this. But at the moment, I feel this is too risky. And please, your first choice should be on creating bamboo for normally construction or for a market where you really have a very firm market, where the risks are low, that you earn back your money.
Okay. This is an interesting one. Can carbon credits be pre-sold before the carbon plantation is created for using this money to create a plantation?
Yeah, so there are different terms for this. They are called ex-ante credits or pending issuance credits, PIUs, or as said, ex-ante. That is possible, but associated with some risks, because later on, if you fail to really grow this, you are liable to eventually replace this by another credit. So you need to deliver then also. Step by step, there are insurance companies also coming in the space, which are trying to say, okay, we can give you an insurance on this one in order to really make this work. But up to now, this market of ex-ante credits is fairly small. It is still becoming quite attractive for companies because the prices of carbon credits are rising. So if the prices are rising, the companies are saying, oh, later on in 5 years, I'm paying double the price. I want to secure my carbon credits as early as possible. That is step by step. Definitely nobody is talking about lower prices in future when it comes to carbon. So that there are some who are doing this, but there are very few. And eventually we need to find them in order to really then say, okay, this is working. And there are also impact investors or certain developing banks which are involved in this. And yeah, it is possible overall, but it is not common. Let's put it this way.
Okay, then in the chat, I've seen a question I missed. That is, what governance and benefit sharing models are needed to ensure that carbon revenues from bamboo forest projects reach local communities and contribute meaningfully to poverty reduction, livelihood improvement, and local economic development in Uganda, East Africa, and globally?
Yeah. So there are community projects. First of all, in my head, there is the landowner topic is first of all essential. There is land which is privately owned. There is land which is owned by government, and if you look on government, you have national government, sometimes regional government, and then also community land. And so, first of all, I hear now in the question, I would expect this is mainly bamboo growing on community land. And here, of course, like on private land, anybody can participate, and there is no exclusion of certain types of land normally within such projects. And then whoever owns the land normally owns also the carbon rights. There are some countries which where the national government takes away your carbon rights, so you can plant the trees, but the government owns the carbon rights. But normally in most countries, it is when you plant the trees, you are the owner of the carbon rights. So if a community is planting the bamboo, owns the carbon rights, they can participate, and eventually it is then, yeah, they are participating. They are the ones signing the contract with the project developer, and the project developer normally gets a fair share also in coordinating the projects, etc. But the main share is, of course, going to the community or the landowners. So in this, how the community is then later on distributing the money they are earning, that's up to them. So normally the carbon standards are not having too many rules on saying how a community should then act. If they want to use it for their hospital, they can do. If they want to use it for the schools, they can do. But that's really up to them. But that's normally how the structure is of money flows. And if later on, for example, a carbon sale comes, so an international company so there's one intermediary normally. So an international company is coming to a carbon broker, mainly being seated then in Europe or the US. And the carbon brokers, there are quite many, they are normally then connected to the project developer. And the carbon broker is getting a certain share, trying to rise the price as much as possible from the company. And then eventually the they buy the credits from the project developer, and the project developer eventually gets the money and distributes this to the landowners behind it. Also, there is no distinction where you might have 10 landowners, but in the carbon credits, you don't see where exactly those carbon credits are coming from. So when there is a sale, normally this is distributed evenly across the ones who are part of this project. So that it's not like, we have now sold the credits from exactly this part. This is not how it works. It works that we have sold it from the project and so much, and then the distribution is happening. Yeah.
Someone has asked a question that is quite technical.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't know what he's talking about, but maybe you know. He's saying, what is the relationship between bamboo and particulate matter? For example, PM10, PM2.5.
PM10 and PM2.
Particulate matter. This is Peter Tomusange. If he's still around, he can clarify, but yeah, I'm not very sure. Particulate matter. Yeah.
Sounds a little bit
pollution. Like... Okay, pollution. Okay. Relationship between bamboo. He's adding that pollution. The measurement of pollution, maybe. Is it how if bamboo reduces air pollution?
That has nothing to do with carbon normally. Normally there's only a measurement of carbon, but air pollution is would only be part of the environmental impact assessment eventually, like in the ecological way. You would say, okay, what is... So every project is having then its social and ecological impacts. And in the ecological impacts, you would see that trees, bamboo is eventually, providing filtering air. Yes, that's what it does. In comparison to a solar cell, which is not filtering air. So that there is an additional benefit, yes, but it's not made for, it's not giving you an additional money. Still, there is, when you see the different carbon prices, in the voluntary carbon market, the prices are made by the story also behind it. So there are certain ecological benefits or social benefits behind projects where companies are willing to pay more of this. And that is definitely something where nature-based projects are, they have a benefit to biodiversity, to social, much more normally than windmill projects or solar and so on and so forth. So that's why you see then quite also between the different forest projects. If you see a forest project of a large landowner in Latin America planting trees and the community in Uganda, you will see normally different prices in the market because the company who are buying this can really also, they want to do something good. This is only for the voluntary market. In the compliance market is all about, we want to get the credits as cheap as possible, and the question is what is allowed and not allowed in these emission trading schemes. And eventually here the co-benefits are not really something which is valued additional. Here companies need to buy something, and eventually the companies are eager to buy as cheap as possible.
There is a question to me, Lucas, how do I join Bamboo Uganda? Yeah, I am going to post a link in the chat. As you have probably heard, Bamboo Uganda is a membership organization, and we organize, besides this online masterclass, we have organized a couple of masterclasses also physically in Uganda about bamboo planting bamboo, about processing bamboo, about architecture with bamboo. Last weekend, for example, we went to Bwindi, where one of our gold founding members is building a lodge with bamboo. So if you remember, you get those invites, you get discounts, sometimes free entry. Yeah, so becoming a member, you simply go to that link that I've just posted, and you fill in the information. You'll find different packages with different benefits, and you choose one of the packages and submit, and then you expect from us an invoice for your membership.
And thank you, Lucas. Just to add to that, members, as you've seen, quite a few things around Bamboo are new. Nobody knows everything around Bamboo because it's such a versatile thing and it has range. So from this conversation, I just learned about the pollution, for example, and I thought I knew quite a lot about Bamboo. So if you are out there, you are thinking about doing business in Bamboo, or you are a donor and you want to find out how can Bamboo be a vehicle for your organization to achieve its objectives, please feel free to hit that link that Lucas has posted and join Bamboo Uganda. Don't die alone and don't carry this weight on your shoulders alone. You are a young entrepreneur or you have invested your savings into Bamboo and you want company. Come join us. Let's carry this load together. Also, Bamboo Uganda gets involved in writing grant applications, funding, sourcing funding, or looking for people who can accelerate businesses, So please join us, join Bamboo Uganda, and let's work this industry together. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for the addition. Before I go to the next question, there's a couple of polls that I have put out. Kindly be reminded before we check out to fill it in so that we can get to know you better, and then can also, in case, approach you and also learn what we should do for the next masterclasses. Yes, someone is asking, can you please post the name of the organization that is buying the carbon credits?
Mm-hmm. So the carbon credit market is a quite diverse market. There are tens of thousands of companies who have been buying carbon credits, and there is not a single list. But what you can do is, if you're interested in seeing, I would refer to two things. First of all, if you Google carbon market reports, there are different carbon market reports, and here you can often see also what kind of buyers are there. Sometimes individual names are also on these ones. And the second thing is, if you go to different carbon registries, you also see a so-called retirement message sometimes. And the retirement message often also says the name of the company that has purchased the carbon credits. So this is where normally you could later on look up who has purchased this. But mainly, or most of the deals are really being made by brokers that assist the companies to be navigating and to be finding their projects. And the background is eventually that the companies themselves don't, as it is a complex market, they don't know themselves exactly what they say. We want to buy something, but we want to be certain that later on we are not buying crap. And eventually, this is why a lot of companies take advisors on their hand to be guiding them and saying, okay, this one is a good project, etc. So we are also advising eventually companies on what to buy and what to not buy. For the sake, because they don't know themselves too much about the market. They are in the business of chocolate or in the business of automobile or whatever, and this is what they are good in.
Okay. We have one question, and I think this is the last one so far. So if anyone has a question, please post it now before we wind up. Please, Moriz, please talk about permanent storage from bamboo manufacturers perspective.
Mhm.
Yes.
So permanent source from a manufacturing. So I can tell you a little bit about the permanence topic overall, which is one of the most discussed topics at the moment in carbon credits when it comes to forestry or nature-based. The question is, if you buy a carbon credit, you want to balance an emission which you have done. And now the question is, with the carbon certification, you are being certified for the next couple of years, normally somewhere around 2 to 3 decades. So 20 to 30 years, sometimes even 40 or longer, this whole carbon projects are lasting. And you can get carbon credits with this, but you also need to be assuring that your forest, which is being planted, remains as long as this. And that is the downside, of course, is really how do you guarantee that over decades you have this carbon being stored. And here it is good to be in group projects, because if in case you want to move out, if you are alone, there's almost no exit possibility to move out of such a project earlier. Overall, carbon standards have developed so-called buffers. So buffers, carbon buffers are that you are not allowed to sell everything on the market, but only a portion. Normally, a buffer is between 15 to about 30%. So you can sell 85 to or 70 to 85% you can sell. The other one, they say, we don't know what's happening in the next 20, 30 years. So the carbon standard itself is saying we put things in the buffer, and if a project is failing, then we can replace those carbon credits. But as said, that's at the moment there are quite a lot of talks on if the buffer is sufficiently filled, for how long it is filled, etc. And the discussions are also how long should the time frame be for such a carbon credit. Some are of the opinion of 100 years, some are of 40 years. My opinion is that we should not be aiming much more than 20 to 30. Also, in the background that I've been in Africa quite a bit, and I just don't see that, the stability of a lot of countries is not so high as some of the. So a lot of buyers are in the US or in Europe. And here they have sometimes thinking a little bit the different time frames, and I see that those time frames in terms of looking 20, 30 years into the future are not very common in Africa, and I also don't believe in them, because if somebody is talking 100 years, I'm also telling them in Germany how crazy this is to be talking in 100 years, because 100 years ago, we have not we have not had a lot of things, and this was before, in Germany, it was before Second World War, before ships or container ships have been invented, before the phone has been eventually spread all over the world, internet was not there, etc., etc. There are so many things. So, and I don't really understand why the people want 100 years to look into the future, because we will see revolutions of technologies in the next couple of decades coming, and that's why I'm just not a believer in looking too far into the future. I'm more over saying keep it 20, 30 years. That's already a long commitment, in my opinion. And if at the later stage of a project is going out of certification after 30 years, you might need to replace it by a certain insurance or by certain other credits which are cheaper. Yeah, that's how life is then. But as I said, to be thinking about, discussions are sometimes on 100 years or somewhere around there, which I found a little bit odd. My saying is perfect is the enemy of good. we need good at the moment, but we don't need perfect.
Okay. Let me see. I see someone has studied. There is actually in Uganda we have one forestry college. I think it's one of the few. So it's asking what career opportunities are available for graduates with diploma in bamboo resources and technology. Yeah, we may not have the answer, but it's worth mentioning that we actually have a diploma in bamboo resource and technology in Uganda. And it's the college, I think it's in Vohrer, Masindi.
Before you answer that, Moriz, sorry, just wanted to let everyone know that we have just a few minutes left. So if you have any questions, please urgently raise them. Otherwise, we'll be closing in a few minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that question was not for me on
No.
Navier College and how this is.
Yeah, I think those were the questions. Yeah, I think the easiest way is to connect further with people is through membership, and then whoever attended, in case of any next masterclass, which hopefully we will have on the same topic, anyone who registered for this one will get the invite. Someone is asking if we will have access to the transcript of this masterclass. So if, in other words, if you're going to share a summary of all of the session, I think we can. Well, Moriz, if you don't have the answer now, we can get back on that one. I would think everyone who attended, we share with them the AI note summary. And I think someone asked about the presentation. Is that going to be shared as well?
Yeah, so the presentation is for education purposes, can be shared amongst the participants here, yes.
Okay, so expect the presentation that Moriz has done, and also a summary from the AI transcript. Yeah, and I think that were all the questions, and thank you so much, Moriz. We have done it exactly within the 2 hours. Maybe my boss will close and then we call it a day.
Excellent.
That is Robert.
Hello. Thank you, Lucas. Why does that feel like a setup? Okay, so Moriz, thank you so much for sharing a highly technical subject, but in a simple and coherent way for the average Joes like us. Most of us here are simple businessmen, and we are happy to digest for you to really break this down into 90 minutes for us to a level that we can understand even the technical stuff. Oh, by the way, thank you for those pictures in your presentation. They were quite helpful. They broke it down. And Lucas, thank you for moderating this. We do look forward to the next one, Moriz. And like someone asked, the next one I think will be more specific about how exactly do you get to participate, you, the person who is following this topic. Lastly, members, the quickest way to join us at Bamboo Uganda, apart from clicking on the links that Lucas has shared, is to go nearly every day or 2 or 3, we post something on the Bamboo Uganda LinkedIn pages. So if you go at Bamboo Uganda on LinkedIn, you will be able to have tremendous visibility in a simple way of everything that Bamboo Uganda is trying to do. And everything we put there is usually inspired by what the members of Bamboo Uganda would like to hear. Very soon, we shall actually post again the rest of the calendar of events for the year. We have a few interesting events lined up for the rest of the year. After the last event we had last weekend in Bwindi, where we visited a real 5-star building that has largely been made of bamboo in Uganda. And now we've had this event. And next week, on Thursday 30th, we are having policymakers and donors in Uganda in one room where we are going to digest the priority policies and activities that will activate the national bamboo strategy for Uganda. If you would like to know what's going on in there, please go to our LinkedIn pages or become a member. Thank you so much, everyone. Certainly, thank you so much, Moriz, and good evening.
Muy mal, Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.